Chapter 18 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 18. The general effect on Stillwater of Mr. Shackford's death, and the peculiar circumstances attending the tragedy, have been set forth in the earlier chapters of this narrative. The influence which that event exerted upon several persons then but imperfectly known to the reader is now to occupy us. On the conclusion of the strike, Richard had returned, in the highest spirits, to his own rooms in Lime Street, but the quiet week that followed found him singularly depressed. His nerves had been strung to their utmost tension during those 13 days of suspense. He had assumed no light responsibility in the matter of closing the yard, and there had been moments when the task of sustaining Mr. Slocum had appeared almost hopeless. Now that the strain was removed, a reaction set in, and Richard found himself unnerved by the fleeing shadow of the trouble which had not caused him to flinch so long as it faced him. On the morning and at the moment when Mary Hennessey was pushing open the scullery door of the house in Welch's Court, and was about to come upon the body of the forlorn old man lying there in his nightdress, Richard sat eating his breakfast in a silent and preoccupied mood. He had retired very late the previous night, and his lackluster eyes showed the effect of insufficient sleep. His single fellow boarder, Mr. Pinkham, had not returned from his customary early walk, and only Richard and Mrs. Spooner, the landlady, were at table. The former was in the act of lifting the coffee cup to his lips when the schoolmaster burst excitedly into the room. "Old Mr. Shackford is dead!" he exclaimed, dropping into a chair near the door. "There's a report down in the village that he had been murdered. I don't know if it's true. God forgive my abruptness. I didn't think." And Mr. Pinkham turned an apologetic face towards Richard, who sat there deathly pale, holding the cup rigidly within an inch or two of his lip, and staring blankly into space like a statue. I ought to have reflected," murmured the schoolmaster, covered with confusion at his maladroitness. "It was very reprehensible in Craggy to make such an announcement to me so suddenly on a street corner. I was quite upset by it." Richard pushed back his chair without replying, and passed into the hall, where he encountered a messenger from Mr. Slocum, confirming Mr. Pinkham's intelligence, but supplementing it with the rumor that Lemuel Shackford had committed suicide. Richard caught up his hat from a table and hurried to Welch's Court. Before reaching the house he had somewhat recovered his outward composure, but he was still pale and internally much agitated, for he had received a great shock, as Lawyer Perkins afterwards observed to Mr. Ward in the reading-room of the tavern. Both these gentlemen were present when Richard arrived, as were also several of the immediate neighbors and 2 constables. The latter were guarding the door against the crowd, which had already begun to collect in the front yard. A knot of carpenters, with their tool-boxes on their shoulders, had halted at the garden gate on their way to Bishop's new stables, and were glancing curiously at the unpainted façade of the house, which seemed to have taken on a remote, bewildered expression, as if it had an inarticulate sense of the horror within. The men ceased their whispered conversation as Richard approached, and respectfully moved aside to let him pass. Nothing had been changed in the cheerless room on the ground floor, with its veneered mahogany furniture and its yellowish leprous wall-paper, peeling off at the seams here and there. A cane-seated chair, overturned near the table, had been left untouched, and the body was still lying in the position in which the Hennessey girl had discovered it. A strange chill, something unlike any atmospherical sharpness, a chill that seemed to exhale from the thin, pinched nostrils, permeated the apartment. The orioles were singing madly outside, their vermilion bosoms glowing like live coals against the tender green of the foliage, and appearing to break into flame as they took sudden flights hither and thither. But within all was still. On entering the chamber, Richard was smitten by the silence, that silence which shrouds the dead, and is like no other. Lemuel Shackford had not been kind or cousinly. He had blighted Richard's childhood with harshness and neglect, and had lately heaped cruel insult upon him. But as he stood there alone, and gazed for a moment at the firmly shut lips, upon which the mysterious white dust of death had already settled, the lips that were never to utter any more bitter things, the tears gathered in Richard's eyes and ran slowly down his cheeks. After all said and done, Lemuel Shackford was his kinsman, and blood is thicker than water. Coroner Whidden shortly appeared on the scene, accompanied by a number of persons. A jury was impaneled, And then began that inquest which resulted in shedding so very little light on the catastrophe. The investigation completed, there were endless details to attend to, papers to be hurriedly examined and sealed, and arrangements made for the funeral on the succeeding day. These matters occupied Richard until late in the afternoon, when he retired to his lodgings, looking in on Margaret for a few minutes on his way home. "This is too dreadful," said Margaret, clinging to his hand, with fingers nearly as icy as his own. "It is unspeakably sad," answered Richard, "the saddest thing I ever knew." Who could have been so cruel?" Richard shook his head. "No one knows." The funeral took place on Thursday, and on Friday morning, as has been stated, Mr. Taggett arrived in Stillwater, and installed himself in Welch's Court, to the wonder of many in the village, who would not have slept a night in that house, with only a servant in the north gable, for half the universe. Mr. Taggett was a person who did not allow himself to be swayed by his imagination. Here then he began his probing of a case which, on the surface, promised to be a very simple one. The man who had been seen driving rapidly along the turnpike sometime near daybreak on Wednesday was presumably the man who could tell him all about it. But it did not prove so. Neither Thomas Blufton nor William Durgin, nor any of the tramps subsequently obliged to drop into autobiography, could be connected with the affair. These first failures served to stimulate Mr. Taggett. It required a complex case to stir his ingenuity and sagacity. That the present was not a complex case he was still convinced, after 4 days' futile labor upon it. Mr. Shackford had been killed, either with malice prepense or on the spur of the moment, for his money. The killing had likely enough not been premeditated. The old man had probably opposed the robbery. Now, among the exceptionally rough population of the town, there were possibly 50 men who would not have hesitated to strike down Mr. Shackford if he had caught them flagrante delicto and resisted them, or attempted to call for succor. That the crime was committed by someone in Stillwater or in the neighborhood, Mr. Taggett had never doubted since the day of his arrival. The clumsy manner in which the staple had been wrenched from the scullery door showed the absence of a professional hand. Then the fact that the deceased was in the habit of keeping money in his bedchamber was a fact well known in the village, and not likely to be known outside of it, though of course it might have been. It was clearly necessary for Mr. Taggett to carry his investigation into the workshops and among the haunts of the class which was indubitably to furnish him with the individual he wanted. Above all, it was necessary that the investigation should be secret. An obstacle obtruded itself here. Everybody in Stillwater knew everybody, and a stranger appearing on the streets or dropping frequently into the tavern would not escape comment. The man with the greatest facility for making the requisite searches would of course be some workman, but a workman was the very agent not to be employed under the circumstances. How many times and by what strange fatality had a guilty party been selected to shadow his own movements or those of an accomplice? No, Mr. Taggett must rely only on himself, and his plan forthwith matured. Its execution, however, was delayed several days, the cooperation of Mr. Slocum and Mr. Richard Shackford being indispensable. At this stage Richard went to New York, where his cousin had made extensive investments in real estate. For a careful man, the late Mr. Shackford had allowed his affairs there to become strangely tangled. The business would detain Richard a fortnight. 3 days after his departure, Mr. Taggett himself left Stillwater, having apparently given up the case, a proceeding which was severely criticized, not only in the columns of the Stillwater Gazette, but by the townsfolk at large, who immediately relapsed into a state of apprehension approximating that of the morning when the crime was discovered. Mr. Pinkham, who was taking tea that evening at the Danas, threw the family into a panic by asserting his belief that this was merely the first of a series of artistic assassinations in the manner of those memorable murders recorded by De Quincey. Mr. Pinkham may have said this to impress the 4 Dana girls with the variety of his reading, but the recollection of De Quincey's harrowing paper had the effect of so unhinging the young schoolmaster that when he found himself, an hour or 2 afterwards, in the lonely, unlighted street, he flitted home like a belated ghost, and was ready to drop at every tree-box. The next forenoon a new hand was taken on at Slocum's Yard. The new hand, who had come on foot from South Millville, at which town he had been set down by the 7 o'clock express that morning, was placed in the apprentice department. There were 5 or 6 apprentices now. Though all this was part of an understood arrangement, Mr. Slocum nearly doubted the fidelity of his own eyes when Mr. Taggett, a smooth-faced young fellow of 21, if so old, with all the traits of an ordinary workman down to the neglected finger-nails, stepped up to the desk to have the name of Blake entered on the payroll. Either by chance or by design, Mr. Taggett had appeared but seldom on the streets of Stillwater. The few persons who had anything like familiar intercourse with him in his professional capacity were precisely the persons with whom his present movements were not likely to bring him into juxtaposition, and he ran slight risk of recognition by others. With his hair closely cropped and the overhanging brown mustache removed, the man was not so much disguised as transformed. "I shouldn't have known him," muttered Mr. Slocum, as he watched Mr. Taggett passing from the office with his hat in his hand. During the ensuing 10 or 12 days, Mr. Slocum never wholly succeeded in extricating himself from the foggy uncertainty generated by that one brief interview. From the moment Mr. Taggett was assigned a bench under the sheds, Mr. Slocum saw little or nothing of him. Mr. Taggett took lodging in a room in one of the most crowded of the low boarding-houses, a room accommodating 2 beds besides his own, the first occupied by a brother neophyte in marble-cutting, and the second by a morose middle-aged man with one eyebrow a trifle higher than the other, as if it had been wrenched out of line by the strain of habitual intoxication. This man's name was Wollaston, and he worked at Dana's. Mr. Taggett's initial move was to make himself popular in the marble yard, and especially at the tavern, where he spent money freely, though not so freely as to excite any remark, except that the lad was running through pretty much all of his small pay, a recklessness which was charitably condoned in Snelling's bar-room. He formed multifarious friendships, and had so many sensible views on the labor problem, advocating the general extinguishment of capitalists, and so on, that his admittance to the Marble Workers' Association resolved itself into merely a question of time. The old prejudice against apprentices was already wearing off. The quiet, evasive man of few words was now a loquacious talker, holding his own with the hardest hitters, and very skillful in giving offense to no one. "Whoever picks up Blake for a fool," Dexter remarked one night, "will put him down again." Not a shadow of suspicion followed Mr. Taggett in his various comings and goings. He seemed merely a good-natured, intelligent devil, perhaps a little less devilish and a trifle more intelligent than the rest, but not otherwise different. Denevan, Peters, Dexter, Wilson, and others in and out of the Slocum clique were Blake's sworn friends. In brief, Mr. Taggett had the amplest opportunities to prosecute his studies. Only for a pained look which sometimes laterally shot into his eyes as he worked at the bench, or as he walked alone in the street, one would have imagined that he was thoroughly enjoying the half-vagabond existence. The supposition would have been erroneous, for in the progress of those 14 days' apprenticeship, Mr. Taggett had received a wound in the most sensitive part of his nature. He had been forced to give up what no man ever relinquishes without a wrench, his own idea. With the exception of an accident in Dana's mill, by which Torrini's hand had been so badly mangled that amputation was deemed necessary, the 2 weeks had been eventless outside of Mr. Taggett's personal experience. What that experience was will transpire in its proper place. Margaret was getting daily notes from Richard, and Mr. Slocum, overburdened with the secret of Mr. Taggett's presence in the yard, a secret confined exclusively to Mr. Slocum, Richard, and Justice Bemis, was restlessly awaiting developments. The developments came that afternoon, when Mr. Taggett walked into the office and startled Mr. Slocum, sitting at the desk. The 2 words which Mr. Taggett then gravely and coldly whispered in Mr. Slocum's ear were, "Richard Shackford." End of Chapter 18.